Hi, we our spotlight presentation is on special education issues for ELL students. I'm Channy Potter.
And I'm Caitlin Sharp.
Okay, so the introduction research. So ELL students, when we were doing this research, ELL students were either overrepresented in third grade and underrepresented in primary grades for special education programs. And the research helps us see why, to try to understand why so many ELL students are put in special education. So, okay, ELL students are placed in special education because of the assessment that they gave them. They are mainly in English, and many of the students are still learning English, so that makes it a lot more difficult.
It makes no sense at all.
There is no proper language proficiency test, so there's no way of actually really testing them on
their English.
Yeah, where they're at on their English. So teacher tends to think that they need extra help on like the academic stuff happening in class. And many teachers lack the training because many of them are not trained to help assist and support ELL kids. And then the Common Core standards are like in a perfect range for Native American English speakers, but they are a lot higher for ELL students.
And going back to that, the teachers lacking training, even when we were doing our community asset mapping, when we called the school to say, what is your program, they said there's not anyone specifically trained to do it. So I think that's a big issue, that there's not enough training among teachers. All right, so this is just further explaining why English language learners are often placed in special education programs. So in one article we read, we found out that 30% of ELL students live in states with limited bilingual education and support. And oftentimes this lack of support and just lack of learning causes behavioral issues, low engagement, high dropout rates. And because of all these things, they look at the students and instead of saying, oh, they need help with their English, they're saying they're having all these behavioral issues and low engagement. Like that looks like triggers for going into special education programs. So they place them in special education programs. But it says that a study has shown that students who receive less native language support are more likely to be placed in special education programs, as Channy was kind of explaining earlier.
Okay, so the misclassification. Many of the students are seen as being disabled or having a difficult time in learning. And just because like disability and ELL students, the language, right? ELL language learning.
Mm-hmm. The language learners.
Yeah, learners are like seen as really similar, so it's really hard to see the difference between them. Students seem to be distracted and have short attention span, which many teachers assume that has to do with disability.
But it's probably just because they don't
understand
what's going on.
What is happening,
or they only understand bits of it.
Mm-hmm. And then seems to be off task, which is the same thing, is that they might only can absorb a certain amount of information and then they don't understand the rest, and then shuts off. And then they have low vocabulary or comprehension, and just sometimes teachers see that as being a disability when they're still just learning English. And then if the student aren't talking, the teacher assume that they aren't understanding what is happening, but they might just be processing what is being said to them. So the disability is being seen as similar to learning English.
Right. All right.
Okay, misconception and reality. So teacher sees that in
just in their classrooms, there's a lot of things that people think that are right, but they're really not. And so we're just really trying to have people be aware of what the misconceptions are. So teaching in your target language, which is usually English, if we're talking about the United States, which we usually are, teaching English is a misconception because they think that, if they're learning English, we should only be teaching them English. We shouldn't be doing any of our classes in their native language, but really that's not helpful if they don't understand the language to begin with.
Yeah, and so the reality is that teachers should be teaching the student in this first language and then incorporating English into that, so they would learn better and be understand
what's exactly.
And then teachers think that trends that
we shouldn't be translating in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of like not really helpful to the student or even the teacher.
It's kind of backwards, yeah.
So,
just work on incorporating lots of translations, and that's the reality, is that translations happen in real life. Even when you're learning language, when you're not in school, you always are needing to ask for translations, and that's a part of learning and growing with that language. So that's definitely something that we should be doing in our classrooms as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so like teachers don't think that we should mix language, like mixing the students' first language to English, and reality is that like we should teach them in the second language and then plus incorporate teaching them in the first language and then incorporating English into the studies.
It's important to be using both languages. If you're bilingual, that means you can speak both languages. I don't know if it's important to incorporate both languages.
Because it's that if you are good in your first language, then you will understand a lot more in your second language.
Yeah, so basically that's it for that slide. All right, so there's a lot of laws that are related to English language learners in relation to special education programs. And the first one is the WAC and then a long list of numbers. And it says that assessments and evaluations must not include racial or cultural bias. It also says that assessments must be given in the student's native language or in the form that is most likely to yield accurate information. So that relates to not only ELLs, but people with disabilities. So for instance, if they were deaf, then obviously their test could be given in a different way, or if they were blind, and it's just making accommodations to different disabilities. And we do that. We do that in school, so why would we not make accommodations to our tests for people that are learning English? Exactly, yeah. And then the second law states that a student cannot be placed in a special education or in special education because of limited English proficiency, which is at the center thing that we're looking at here. So yeah. And so there's a lot of different categories of disabilities that can have you be served in a special education setting. So some of those different categories that make you eligible for special education are visual or hearing impairments, like being deaf or blind, like we were talking about earlier, autism, traumatic brain injury, and that's a long list that goes on of different disabilities that people might have that are in the special education program. But when it comes to ELL students, it can sometimes appear that they fall into one of the SPED categories, even though technically they don't. And some of those ones would be intellectual disabilities, emotional behavioral disabilities, because some of them have come from really traumatic situations from a different country that they moved from. Other health impaired is a category. Communication disorder is a category. Developmental delay. And last, this one is in bold because it's a really important one, and it's called specific learning disability. So more on that in this slide. Specific learning disability is a really broad category in the special education program guidelines, I guess, and about half of all special education students are part of this category. So it's something that if you are in the special education program, your disability could most likely fall into this area. It's just a really broad category in the special education. It's an important category because it's hard to identify. Even just the name of it, specific learning disability, it's basically like the other category. Like if you didn't fit into one category, then your category might be specific learning disability. Most ELL students are placed in this category or most ELL students are placed in special education falling under this category, which makes sense. And then these are references. So that's ours. Obviously, we see that there's a lot of issues in the classroom revolving around special education and ELL students, and it's just sad that instead of getting them the help they need with language proficiency and working with someone that is trained to teach language, they're just put into the special education program.
So mostly is that the main point of this presentation is that teachers need to be educated to be able to classify the difference between disability and students that are just learning English.
Which is what all of us are being trained to do, so yay! Yeah. So yeah, that's our presentation. Thank you.